1964 is generally known to be the biggest Democratic landslide to have happened in the U.S. in modern political times, arguably bigger than 1936. We'll look at the 1964 election soon, but what's interesting to note is how certain states have only made marginal shifts relative to 1964. Looking at California, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, these states have all moved Democratic relative to 1964. And looking at a map like 2020, you'll see states like Arizona and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Vermont also shifting towards the Democratic Party. Because, as you know, between 2020 and 2024, the nation got quite a bit redder. Now, obviously, between 2024 and 1964, almost the whole country got bluer. But you can tell in some states, you know, in the light red, like Virginia and Maryland and Vermont, Arizona, South Carolina, have had minimal shifts towards Trump compared to the rest of the country. And and even in states like Washington and Delaware, his shifts weren't awfully impressive. And then you look at 2020 relative to everything, and then you'll realize, states like Louisiana and Illinois only made small shifts, you know. So it's just difficult to really fully analyze and appreciate, how much the nation has shifted since 1964. Also, just so you know, Nebraska and Maine are both at larges, but the districts didn't have their own votes yet. Fun fact, in 1964, if Nebraska had congressional district voting, the first and second would have voted for Democrats. The third district still would have been won by a Republican, even though Democrats won the state at large. And here's the thing you have to realize about 64. When you look at 64, you obviously see, a tremendous Democratic influence. But Republicans dominated the Deep South. Goldwater was the first Republican to win the Deep South in Deep South states since, the 1870s. Looking at 1876, Louisiana and South Carolina do vote for the Republicans. And beforehand, it was more consistent, and it knew the disenfranchisement of black people that took place as we move through. But after that, the South, the former Confederacy, and especially the Solid South, was solidly Democratic. Even the border states were oftentimes solidly Democratic. Um, but a lot of that changed in 1896, and by 1904, even Missouri joined the party. So, border states were sometimes Democratic, sometimes Republican, but the former Confederacy was always, Republican. Took until 1920, a huge Republican landslide, for Harding to win Tennessee by 3.1 points. In 28, we see Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia finally flip. And then we have to go until 1952 and 1956 to see more states vote red. And even then, only Louisiana is a solid South state that actually backs Eisenhower. So then, obviously, you get to 1964, and you have the solid South, which actually votes Republican and solidly Republican. Even in 1960, these states were still voting Democratic. Looking at an analysis, Louisiana votes for Goldwater by 13.6, Mississippi votes for Goldwater by 74.3, Alabama votes for Goldwater by 38.9, Georgia by 8.3, South Carolina 17.8. Looking at Arizona, votes for Goldwater by 1%. This is because Goldwater was from Arizona, and in this time, Arizona was historically a Republican leaning state. Similar to how, in 84, Mondale was able to to get Minnesota. He was from Minnesota, and as you could see, it was a pretty Democratic leaning state throughout time. I mean, even in 72, look at how close it was for Richard Nixon in relation to a national landslide. And again, almost all the states are solid blue in this election. Even states like North Dakota and Alaska, states that would never vote for a Democrat again. You have Utah, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Indiana, Florida, and Idaho are states that were actually close. All these states, they'd either never vote Democrat again after 1964, or in a lot of cases, these states could have been in the solid South. You know, where even though Goldwater couldn't break through in windy states, he certainly made it close. The only really exception to this is Indiana, and even in the case of Indiana, it would take until 2008 for the state to vote Democrat again. Same for Virginia, honestly, and North Carolina's in 76. You can look through the progression of these maps and see how, Republican leaning these states have truly been in this modern era. And Arkansas is also real. Is also really the only other exception to this. But even that was a form of Confederate state. It's really Oklahoma that's the main exception. Although did Oklahoma ever vote vets in '64? I don't think it did actually. I think it's only voted vets in '64. I could check. Oh, it actually is the last time a Democrat won Oklahoma. Shocking. But you see my point. So the point is, Democrats landslides galore. So in such a Democratic landsliding environment, the only way that you could really see states not really shift heavily towards Republicans is if the states overall, on average, shifted politically. And we can, look at the 2024 election and sort of see. Like Mississippi and Alabama, both states that were solid for Trump. But 22.9 point is not the same as 74. 30.5 is still less than, what did, than 38.9. South Carolina, it was about 17.9 in both cases. Looking at some strongly blue states, California voted for Harris by 20. Look at the results in 64. It only voted for Johnson by 18.3. And you look at Vermont, which voted for Johnson by 32.6. You look at 2024, it was 31.5. Some of these very strongly, Democratic states today. And also Virginia, which was in that weird zone. So it didn't really shift that much towards him. And Biden won Virginia and Maryland by more than Johnson did. You also have to realize that Georgia and Arizona have now become swing states. So obviously, these states are going to be closer. Now, in 2024, not so much, but in 2020, the Democrats actually won Arizona and Georgia too. But the last time that Georgia voted Republican by a larger margin than 1964, you have to go back to 2004. Because the state has taken a huge leftward shift since. and has been a swing state really from 2008 on, but especially in 2016 on. Just that didn't become obvious until 2020. And you can really compare, um, two elections and see even when the political environment, rapidly shifts. When you compare two elections from this long ago, it's very rare to have, a complete result. Compare 84 to 2004. Wyoming, the Dakotas, Iowa, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, West Virginia still shift rightwards. West Virginia was the largest shift, mainly because it used to be a Democratic stronghold and now it's a Republican stronghold. But still. And, the more different elections you compare it to, the more different that your results will get. Because even comparing 84 to '08, West Virginia still shifts right. From 2000 to 1984, Montana still shifts right. Now, I guess this isn't true for 1996, but you'll realize that was a huge Democratic landslide as well. And, we can even go to 64 and then pull the time machine and see how the changes weren't consistent. You know, you can always see, I mean, granted, Democrats generally did better in these elections, but, like, you could still see, especially in the Solid South, the holes that, as we had these elections, that, like, they were still always trending blue just because of how red they were in 1964. Um, Obviously, the more favorable the year got for Democrats, the less significant that we saw this change become, and that's pretty obvious. But like obviously 1996 doesn't really see the same shift. Is powerful, and 2008 especially, given what happened. But like even 1984, Mississippi and Alabama still shift significantly towards Mondale. You know, and even in 1972, Mississippi and Alabama still shift significantly towards McGovern because they have to. They genuinely had to. The only exception was 1968, but even then, all these states shifted significantly towards George Wallace. And every state shifted by more than 15 points to Nixon, except for